topic is Malcolm X. The guest is Dr. AAl-Hadid, the chairperson of Africana Studies at Tennessee State University. And of course, Doctor, before we had our break, you promised that you would give us some information relative to Malcolm outside of the nation. And of course, we'll give you an opportunity to do that now.
Yeah, the Malcolm outside of the Nation of Islam was a new man, totally transformed. He didn't continue to spout racist rhetoric. He was a person who was actually moving a lot closer to Martin Luther King. As a matter of fact, in February of 1965, just before his assassination, he'd actually gone to Selma, Alabama, in order to form a coalition of conscience with Martin Luther King. Unfortunately, at the time, Dr. King was in jail, but he did take counsel with his wife, Coretta Scott King, Andrew Young, Bernard Lafayette, as well as John Lewis. And he was trying to say that he made some mistakes when he was inside of the Nation of Islam, and he understood that Martin Luther King's strategy of freedom, justice, and equality was the best way for our people to go. So he wanted to take the civil rights struggle from the level of civil rights to the level of human rights. And rather than trying to lodge our case with the United States Supreme Court, he wanted to make an argument for human rights before the United Nations and the World Court, because he actually saw, you know, today, for example, we hear people talking about genocide going on in the Sudan or other parts of the world. In 1964 and 65, Malcolm was saying that the white supremacist government of this country, the white supremacists in this country were actually committing acts of genocide against African Americans. So he was making the case for genocide and also making the case for human rights. And he was trying to get a buy-in from Dr. King in order to move in that direction. And you have to remember now, both Dr. King and Malcolm had gone outside of this country in 1964. Malcolm made the pilgrimage in April of '64, and Dr. King got the Nobel Peace Prize in December of 1964. So when both of these men came back inside of the United States in 1964, they had shifted from a race-based analysis of the problem to more or less a class analysis and also an international analysis. You remember Dr. King was talking about voting rights. He was also talking about, he started to move against the war in Vietnam. And Malcolm had already been there some years early, even when he was in the Nation of Islam. So they both started to deal more with human rights issues. They both started to deal with international issues, being opposed to the war in Vietnam, being opposed to the apartheid government in South Africa. And it looked as though the two men were starting to come together. As a matter of fact, he was assassinated on February 21st, 1965, which was on a Sunday at 3 o'clock. That following Tuesday, he was supposed to meet with Martin Luther King at the home of Sidney Poitier. They were supposed to come together and have a discussion about how Malcolm could get on board with the civil rights movement and take it to the next level. Because there's no doubt that Malcolm completely dominated the ghettos of the North, and also some of the ghettos on the West Coast, like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and so forth. King completely dominated the southern region. So the leaders, these two leaders, one being the champion of the blacks in the inner cities of the North, and the other one being the champion of the working class in the South, as well as the peasants, the sharecroppers in the South, in Alabama, and Mississippi, and Arkansas. So had those two men come together in 1965, the kind of problems that we're looking at now would probably not be in existence, because those two men, I think, working in tandem, working together, would have been the type of unity that we needed on the international front as well as the local scene.
You know, you spoke earlier about Dr. King and Malcolm, and I think that at one time you indicated that Malcolm and King sort of play the same role in a real sense, and they were both disliked intensely by J. Edgar Hoover. Touch upon that. I mean, what was Malcolm's relationship with Mr. Hoover, and why? And I think that there's even some suggestion that the government might have had something to do with his assassination, even though the government itself did not assassinate him. He was, from what I understand, he was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam's organization. But speak to that.
Yeah, that was a myth, I think, and I would want to call it a myth that was sort of operating inside of the intelligence community in this country at that time. And much of it had to do with the fact that we were in the Cold War, you know, the communism versus the Western so-called democracies. And so J. Edgar Hoover had this idea that he wanted to stop the rise of a Messiah, almost like Pharaoh during the times of Moses. And he did see Dr. King and Malcolm as a possibility of being that Messiah that would rise up among the African Americans and free them from the bondage of modern-day Pharaoh. And so that was the mythology that J. Edgar Hoover operated out. And I would think that even to this very day, there's still that paranoia that somehow the Most High will come with divine intervention and raise up another Messiah in our midst who will free us from that type of oppression. But that was the type of mythology that was operating that time period. And also the fact that just before Malcolm and Martin, you know, you had Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois who had declared themselves as communists. And they had traveled to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So there was a possibility that they too would make those links with the communist faction outside of this country. So the Cold War played a major role in how the civil rights movement. As a matter of fact, there were people in King's movement that had to leave the movement because people thought that they were communists. Martin Luther King in the early 50s was accused of being a communist, you know. So I think that was the kind of idea that J. Edgar Hoover was operating from, this fear of communism rising up in the form of a black messiah among African Americans.
Now, what is the legacy of of Malcolm X?
Sure.
I mean, what role do you think that he continues to play in our society today?
In my judgment, I think the legacy of, as I would call him, El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, because when he made the pilgrimage to Mecca, he changed his name. I think that when you look at the year 1965, this was a very powerful year. This is a year that Malcolm made the pilgrimage to Mecca. This is a year that Dr. King did the Selma to Montgomery March in terms of the Voting Rights Act. But he was effective in linking the Muslim world with African-American Muslims in this country. He was also effective in linking the African continent with the struggle inside of this country. So as a spokesperson for Pan-Africanism and also a spokesperson for Muslims all over the world, I think he was very effective in making that link. And then once he made that link of American Muslims in general and African Americans in particular with the Muslim world, it was at that time that immigrant Muslims started to gain more confidence. In fact, they started forming their association like the Muslim Student Association and other organizations. And then, of course, in '65, immigration policies changed, and more people were allowed to come in this country from Muslim countries, like in the Middle East and Turkey. And so eventually the immigrant Muslims started to stand up and advocate Islam. When they first came in this country after the First World War, which was a collapse of the Ottoman Empire, they were told specifically, it's all right for you to come to this country, but don't have any conversation about Islam. Just come in here, be quiet, practice Islam among fellow immigrant Muslims, but do not try to convert African Americans to Islam. They told them specifically not to try to convert African Americans to Islam because they knew that when African Americans came to this country from Africa, and many of them, I would say as many as 50% of them were Muslims
already,
who were part of the Moorish Empire as well as the Songhai Empire, and they wanted to remind these African American Muslims that before they came over here, they were Muslims. And then when they came over here, the ordeal of the plantation put them in a situation where they no longer had knowledge of their Islamic background. And so that was the reason that immigration and the State Department tried to keep immigrant Muslims away from African-American Muslims.
And so there's a long legacy of Malcolm, and even though he and Dr. King are no longer with us, that their ideas and their aspirations for African Americans continue to exist. Would you say that?
Yeah, I think after the Spike Lee's movie, there was a resurgence of an interest in Malcolm X, and that's why I'm trying to get my book together, which will loosely be entitled Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Muslim and Pan-African Statesman. And I also think that in a post-9/11 world, it would be good for all Americans to look at Malcolm's religious biography so that they too can have a better understanding of the Muslim world rather than seeing the Muslim world through the eyes of people who are making a bad name for Islam.
Or look at the book that you and Dr. Lewis Baldwin produced, Between Cross and Crescent. I think that would do the same thing.
Sure.
Okay, and of course, let me thank you, Dr. Al-Hadid, and let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.